أوكي، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا ما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So now we are starting with the Ashab al-A'mash. So what are we talking about here? So when we first start studying hadith, the picture we're given is that thiqah from thiqah makes sahih, right? Sahih hadith. Here's a reliable narrator who studied with the previous person, and that previous person is reliable, and he studied with the previous person, and that person is reliable. Therefore, the hadith is sahih. It's not actually like that. That's an oversimplification. In reality, we need to know a bit more about what's going on. So there's two variables or three variables that we can think about. Variable is where are you in history? So are you a Sahabi? Are you a Tabi'i? Are you an early Tabi'i, middle Tabi'i, late Tabi'i, early follower of the Tabi'in, middle or late? Where are you in history? That's number one, right? Because as we know, the further away you are from the Prophet ﷺ, right, the longer the chain, the less likely it is of tafarrud, the less likely it is that you be the only person narrating this hadith. So all right, and also the further you away from the Prophet ﷺ, the more likelihood that there is of error. Right? So each time we're multiplying the possibility of error. So what's going to happen is the further away you are from the Prophet ﷺ, the higher the higher standard I'm going to request. Right? I'm going to try and get something higher, because it is less likely that somebody who is not so amazing that would narrate a hadith that no one else narrates, and also somebody who's not that amazing quite likely make a mistake. So that's one variable. Which tabaqa are you in? Okay. Variable number two, what is your connection to this person? So are you his scribe that you spent 20, 30 years with him? Are you somebody who just visited for the weekend? Right? So you might be amazing, but you only came and visited him for the weekend. And you studied a few hadith from him and left. And you could be not so good, but you're his scribe. Right? So that's also relevant. Okay? So variable number one, where are you in history? Variable number two, the actual type. So not just did you narrate from him, but how did you narrate from him? Right? So that's important as well. So that's what we're looking here, the Ashab al-A'mash. The students around A'mash, who are they? Right? And how strong is their connection? And relatively, how strong is their connection? So Shu'bah and A'mash, are they the same? Because what if Shu'bah narrates a hadith in one way and Thawri in another way? Right? So I want to know what's going on. The third, which is kind of related to the first, is the content. What are you narrating? Oh, you're narrating that it's good to be nice to your mum? Okay, big deal. I don't really care. Go ahead. Hadith's fine. But you're narrating something there's a key fiqh point that other people should know. Well, it is a key point of piece of evidence. Oh, right. That's a key piece of evidence, right? Key witness account. That's very important. Suddenly we're now going to ask for higher standards, right? So at least three variables that we're looking at. Where are you in history? I guess fourth then. Four, how good are you in general? As in general, how good are you? Where are you in history? What's your relationship with this person? And how good are you from that person? Right? That's kind of like, so you might be good, but you're known to make mistakes from this person. So I can't just say you're good, because I know that when you're narrating from so-and-so, you made mistakes. Or you're good, not so good, but when you narrate from so-and-so, you did make mistakes. Okay? So I need to know what's going on. You're not just good. That's not a thing. Right? I'll give you an example of that. Volkswagen versus Kia. What do you think? Which is a better car? Tabaqa means where are you in history? Which level of history? Right? What's a better car? A Volkswagen or a Kia? A Kia is better than Volkswagen? What do you think, Ammar? Asim? Volkswagen Golf isn't that an epic car? Pick in Europe. Exactly. Ammar says, for what purpose? And might you also ask which country? Right? So I was in Jordan, right? I was in Jordan. I got my first car was a Volkswagen Polo. It's like a mini version of the Golf, okay? And I was told, Habibi, it's not actually very good for the Arab for the Middle East because the cars are designed for actually cooler places. Like, it's designed for cooler places. It's not actually so good. Whereas a Kia is actually better, like a Kia, which is from North Korea, right? Or something like a Toyota. Toyotas don't really overheat. I don't know. People have but like Golfs overheat, right? So my car was kept overheating. Does that make sense? So is it good for what? Yeah. Korea. Yeah, Kia is a Korean car. Kia is not is yeah, South Korea. But anyway, Korea I'm talking about, right? So um so totally different place, right? So it's good for what? In terms of cheap parts, Korean car be better, right? In terms of something else, right? So you can't just say good or bad. That doesn't mean anything. We're not dealing with math. We're not dealing with numbers, right? A soccer player, is it fair to give him numbers? Like just one thing, 1 to 10, is that okay? No, you got to say you're looking at different things, right? Different things about them, right? Does that make sense? So here we're not dealing with maths. We're dealing with people. People change. People have specific things. Is it this person? How did he narrate? When? How? Why? What is he doing? Right. So part of that is knowing the tabaqat. So I'm going to, for example, say Yahya al-Qattan, good. Hafs ibn Ghiyath, good. But Yahya ibn Qattan is a closer in the circle of Al-A'mash than Hafs ibn Ghiyath. So if they narrate a hadith in two different ways, right? Or maybe if somebody down here like Abu Awana, he might narrate a hadith in a certain way and might not accept it because he's not really somebody of those key people who narrates from him, right? So he says here, أصحاب الأعمش قال النسائي هم 7 طبقات. الأولى يحيى بن سعيد أي يحيى بن سعيد القطان الثوري سفيان الثوري and شعبة. Okay, that's number one. Then we have, so these are all of the same tabaqa in terms of history, but they're not in the same time in the same tabaqa in terms of how close they are and how much time they spent with Nasai, with Al-A'mash. And he says, Zaida ibn Abi Zaida, Hafs ibn Ghiyath, Abu Muawiyah, Jarir ibn Abdul Hamid, Abu Awana. Right? So this is not Awana. Abu Awana is a also later scholar, right? The Mustadrak of Abu Awana, that's somebody else, right? This is Abu Awana, who's the earlier stage. قطبة ابن عبد العزيز مفضل ابن مهلهل داود الطائي فضيل ابن عياض and Abdullah Mubarak الخامسة ابن إدريس عيسى ابن يونس وكيع the teacher of Imam Shafi'i حميد الرؤاسي عبد الله بن داود الفضل بن موسى زهير بن معاوية السادسة أبو أسامة وابن نمير وعبد الواحد بن زياد السابعة عبيدة ابن حميد وعبدة ابن سليمان. Okay, so now we're going to a new topic. So this is what we need to know. You don't just want to know if is he reliable or not. I want to know this person's relationship with that narrator. Okay, فصل في الحديث الغريب وأنواع الحديث وأما الحديث الغريب فهو ضد المشهور. Right? So this is problematic because you say al-mashhur, for the late scholars will say mashhur is a hadith whose chain, the number of narrators in each level is always 3 or more. So that means 3 or more Sahaba narrated it, and from them 3 or more tabi'een. That's mashhur. So then everything else is gharib, right? So that doesn't it's a bit confusing. So in reality, there is these two phrases, gharib and shadh, they're going to be kind of used in, you know, in interchangeably, right? So a hadith can be gharib and that's problematic, and a gharib and not problematic. Okay, and we'll look at that in a second. Up to, they're the students of Al-A'mash. Okay, وأما الحديث الغريب فهو ضد المشهور وقد كان السلف يمدحون المشهور من الحديث ويذمون الغريب منه في الجملة in general, right? And this is the approach of the Hanafis, of the Malikis. So Imam Malik is brought a hadith that he's never heard of. The fact that he's never heard of it means it's weak, right? Here's a hadith that establishes a new concept in fiqh that none of the Salaf or none of the key fuqaha of the Salaf seem to have known, right? That we're just going to reject it. That's the Hanafi approach. It's gharib, it's weird, right? So that's in terms of content, right? That's their approach. And in general, right, the Salaf are like, what is this? Right? Something that's unknown. ومنه قال ابن مبارك العلم هو الذي يجيئك من ها هنا ومن ها هنا, right? From more than one direction. That's knowledge, right? It's not like the first time you've ever heard this idea. Okay? Now, in principle, that is not the Shafi approach. Shafi approach is hadith is sahih. It doesn't matter if it doesn't come from here and there. It just has to come from here. And here, one direction and it's sound. But it's not as simple as that. يعني مشهور وخرج البيهقي من طريق الترمذي عن أحمد بن عبد عن ابن وهب عنه وخرج أيضا من طريق الزهري عن علي بن حسين قال ليس من العلم ما لا يعرف إنما العلم ما عرف وتواطعت عليه الألسن, right? Something that's well known. So Imam Malik, this is how everybody prays. That's what we're going to do, right? وبإسناده عن مالك قال شر العلم الغريب وخير العلم الظاهر الذي قد رواه الناس. There's no تفرد. وروى محمد بن جابر عن الأعمش عن إبراهيم قال كانوا يكرهون غريب حديث وغريب الكلام, right? So here غريب الحديث, today when you say غريب الحديث, that means tricky words that are in hadith that you need to look up in a dictionary. What they mean is they used to like hadith you've never heard before. وعن أبي يوسف قال من طلب غرائب الحديث كذب, right? Whoever tries to seek hadith that no one's ever heard before, he will be lied to, or he'll be labeled as a liar. قال أبو نعيم كان عندنا رجل يصلي كل يوم 500 ركعة سقط حديثه في الغرائب, right? So there was a man who was very religious, right? MashaAllah. Half a 500 rak'ahs every day. MashaAllah. سقط حديثه في الغرائب. Why? He keeps narrating hadiths that other people don't narrate. So the default, in order to become a thiqah, this is what you do. You have 100,000 hadiths, and they're basically the same as everyone else's hadiths. You keep showing again and again and again. You narrate from the same narrators, the same content as everybody else. And then one day, after doing that for a long time, I see that you have a hadith that no one else narrates. I'll trust you because your track record is good, right? But otherwise, I don't know, how do you become a thiqah? How are you labeled to be a thiqah is by narrating a hadith that other people narrate, basically. We saw that quote from Imam Shafi before. وقال عمرو بن خالد سمعت زهير بن معاوية يقول لعيسى بن يونس ينبغي لرجل أن يتوقع رواية غريب الحديث فإني أعرف رجل كان يصلي في اليوم 200 ركعة ما أفسده عند الناس إلا رواية غريب الحديث. Same thing. وذكر مسلم في مقدمة كتابه من طريق حماد بن زيد أن أيوب قال لرجل لزمت عمرا قال نعم إنه يجيئنا بأشياء غرائب أي بأشياء غريبة قال يقول له أيوب إنما نفر أو نفرق نخاف, right? إنكم لقوم يفرقون فرق يفرق فرقا to be scared, right? من تلك الغرائب, it's weird. So it's sometimes not just the hadith, just the content. The content of the hadith is odd. You never had a hadith that talks about something like that before, right? وقال رجل لخالد بن الحارث أخرج لي حديث الأشعث لعلي أجد فيه شيئا غريبا, right? Tell me something about that al-Ash'ath, something I've never heard before. فقال لو كان فيه شيء غريب لمحوته. If there's something you never heard before, I would have erased it. ونقل علي بن عثمان النفيلي عن أحمد قال شر الحديث الغرائب التي لا يعمل بها ولا يعتمد عليها. Right? So hadith that are not acted upon and are not relied upon. So notice the concept of amal. Right? Amal is very important. Right? So if you just flick through Tirmidhi, you're going to be like, oh, this hadith is weak, but everybody acts upon it. This hadith is sahih, but basically nobody acts upon it. That's pretty important. So it is not true in an absolute sense. It is not true in an absolute sense that whenever the hadith is sahih, we act upon it. That's not true. Relied upon. وقال المروذي سمعت أحمد يقول تركوا الحديث وأقبلوا على الغرائب ما أقل الفقه فيهم. Right. Cool, interesting facts. Cool, interesting hadith that no one's heard before. ونقل محمد بن سهل بن عسكر عن أحمد أنه قال إذا سمعت أصحاب الحديث يقولون هذا حديث غريب أو فائدة not sure what I'm saying فاعلم أنه خطأ أو دخل حديث أو دخل حديثا فحديث أو خطأ من المحدث أو ليس له إسناد وإن كان قد روى شعبة وسفيان even if it's whatever right وإذا سمعتم يقولون لا شيء فاعلم أنه صحيح حديث صحيح أو إذا سمعتم يقولون لا شيء they're not saying anything not فاعلم أنه حديث صحيح. So when they criticize it with these kind of things is weird. قال أحمد بن يحيى سمعت أحمد غير مرة يقول لا تكتبوا هذه الأحاديث الغرائب فإنها مناكير وعامتها عن الضعفاء. Right. So basically you can imagine a period of time where error leads to error and you end up with random content. That's what we're talking about. Right, random content. So content is very important. It's not a small thing. We mentioned that was one of the variables, right? Looking at the content. We've spoken about that at length before. قال أبو بكر الخطيب أكثر طالبي الحديث في هذا الزمان يغلب عليهم كتب الغريب دون المشهور وسماع المنكر دون معروف واشتغال بما وقع فيه السهو والخطأ من رواية المجروحين والضعفاء حتى لقد صار الصحيح عند أكثرهم مجتنبا والثابت مصدوفا عنه مطرحا وذلك لعدم معرفة بأحوال الرواة ومحلهم ونقصان علمهم بالتمييز وزهدهم في تعلمه وهذا خلاف ما كان عليه الأئمة من المحدثين والأعلام من أسلافنا الماضين وهذا الذي ذكره الخطيب حق نجد كثيرا مما ينتسب إلى الحديث لا يعتني بالأصول الصحاح كالكتب الستة ونحوها ويعتني بالأجزاء الغريبة بمثل مسند البزار ومعاجم الطبراني وأفراد الدارقطني وهي مجمع الغرائب والمناكير. Right, so this is one of the reasons why it's so important to to start with Muwatta. So the Muwatta is the opposite of this. Right, what is your initial exposure to hadiths is the Muwatta. These are super clean hadiths. Right, they are not all the hadiths, and there are other many important halal haram hadiths of the halal haram, but it's a good place to start and build from there. Right, you build from there. And it was arguably the case that there are certain hadiths like this in the 6 books that are a bit weird. Right? No. So the Muwatta is Imam Malik selecting certain hadiths along with certain fatwa of the Sahaba and Tabi'een that are acted upon in Medina. So it's not acted upon in an absolute sense, but in Medina at least. So for example, he'll tell us that Ibn Umar used to join Maghrib and Isha during rain. So why is he telling us that? He's telling that this is not just a quote. This is something that we actually do in Medina. Like in Medina, we join Maghrib and Isha when it is raining. Right? So what he'll frequently do is quote a hadith or fatwa of Sahabi or Tabi'i, and he says, "Wala amru andana kada." What do we do in Medina? This. So that's Imam Malik's structure. Right? That's how it works. Right? But in general, when you're reading the Muwatta, you're seeing hadiths that are clean, there's no errors in them, and they're not weird. Okay? Whereas when you start to go further out, that's when you start to see things like this is something's off sometimes here and there. So just where do you start? Right? So if you start with the Muwatta, and you go into Bukhari and Muslim, and then you go into Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi, right? So you kind of extend like that. Right? No. So here's a problem, Muhammad, is nothing is served on a plate for us. So the best version of that is a madhab. You have a madhab, which is an edit of what the Sahaba and Tabi'in did, and an edit of the best interpretation of it, and one edit of if they did different things, which is the strongest, right? That's basically a madhab, right? But that's just one edit, and it's not a perfect edit. So when you study a madhab, it's one take, right? There's another take, and another take, and another take. So that process of saying, I just want to see all the hadith in one place. You're not going to see all the hadith in one place anywhere. I just want to see all the fatwa, the Sahaba and Tabi'in in one place. You will never see that anywhere. I just want to see all fiqh rulings in one place. You will never ever see that. So that's why you just have to start in a curriculum for oneself as a talib ilm is the question is, okay, well, at least where should I start? Okay, learn a madhab, right? Learn your basics of aqidah, or these different kind of things. You start one place, right? Start with your Arabic grammar, morphology, you do this, you do that, etc. Right? And then you start building out. But you will necessarily come to scenarios that will confuse you, right? Seems like a necessity to have collated fatwas of the learned Sahaba. It doesn't exist because you can't find it all in one place. So that process of editing what the Sahaba said and which is the strongest is called a madhab. So the best way to start doing that is to learn a madhab, because then you will actually know the concepts. And then when you start looking at the books that mention here and there, this Sahabi said this, you start to notice that's random and weird. Like Ibn Umar allegedly said you have to make wudu for touching your armpit. Okay, is that right or wrong? Is that correct in narration, or is that correct in terms of application? I don't know. Never studied any fiqh. But if you say, no, I know my madhab, I've studied this madhab, these are the things that break your wudu. That is not something that breaks your wudu. Touching your armpit, right? That's weird. So you already know that's weird in terms of content or weird in terms of, I don't know what, it's just odd, off. Right? So a madhab, learning one madhab is one of the most useful things in order to, like a tool in order to help you sift out hadiths that are weird and possibly not acted upon, or fatwa that are not real or not acted upon. So you have that basis. And then you start off with key books and you build from there. Like Kitab al-Athar by Imam Muhammad, or Kitab al-Athar by Qadi Abu Yusuf, right? Or the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, right? Or the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Okay? So these places are useful, right? Whereas here he mentions Bazzar, like Bazzar, the Kitab Bazzar is about 20 volumes, it's huge, number one, right? It's huge. And it is basically a collection of hadiths that are gharib. So he'll say, here's this hadith, I've traveled the Muslim world, I have only heard so-and-so narrate this hadith from so-and-so. Otherwise, it's not known, right? So it's an odd hadith. Or Afrad al-Daraqutni. Daraqutni is specifically collecting Afrad, hadiths that no one else narrates. Only so-and-so day is trying to show the error, right? Or even the Sunan of Daraqutni. Sunan Daraqutni, he's doing that to show errors as well. So your learning basis was a place of errors. That's not a clever thing to do. I'm not saying the book isn't useful, but you should start with something simpler. Yes and no. So gharib means only one person narrated it. So, for example, here's a hadith that was only narrated by Sayyidina Umar. That's gharib. That's not a problem. Okay? But when you start to go down further away from the Sahaba and Tabi'een and Tabi'een, it can become a problem. So you're the only person to narrate this hadith from Imam Malik, despite the fact that the whole world is going to Imam Malik. Why? Right? Did you spend 20 years with Imam Malik, something that was different? Or what's going on here? Right? So that's gharib and problematic. Or you're not that good, right? You're good, but you're not that good. Does that make sense? ومن جملة الغرائب المنكرة الأحاديث الشاذة المطرحة وهي نوعان وهو الشاذ الإسناد وسيذكر الترمذي فيما بعد بعض أمثلته وهو شاذ المتن كالأحاديث التي صحت الحديث بخلافها أو أجمعت أئمة العلماء على القول بغيرها. Right? So there's the chain itself. Other people narrate this hadith in another way with a different chain. It's totally off. Right? So for example, in Ibn Hibban, right? In Ibn Hibban, we find the hadith. What is it? I'll show this to you actually, it's useful. Hmm. So Muhammad, anyway, the idea that everything's in one place. I just want one book that solves all my problems. It doesn't exist anywhere. So every matan is helping you save as much time as possible. A matan in hadith, a matan in fiqh, a matan in usul, a matan. It's trying to help you save as much possible as make this very, very complex thing called knowledge as easy as possible, but it will never be easy. Right? So this is knowledge. You're a toddler, okay? And I'm teaching you how to swim. So before you do anything, you need to how to crawl. Okay, you can crawl. Okay, can you walk? You can walk. Can you run? Can you run? Can you move your arms? Okay, great. So now we're going to go to the baby pool. You're going to learn how to swim in the baby pool. Now we go to the big pool. Okay. Now I'm going to take you to the edge of the ocean. And now you're going to go inside and you're going to go into the Pacific. And I don't know what's in there. And you're like, hey, might there be sharks there? So I don't know. Right. So I prepared you as much as I could. That's what they do. But no one's going to solve everything for you. It doesn't work like that because it's not possible. All they can do is a curriculum can save as much time as possible. So why would you study a book? Say this book is going to help me save as much time as possible. That's all. But they can't take you to the end. Nobody can do that. So when you study, for example, classical books in fiqh, you've saved a lot of time. A Salafi, for example, who does not study classical books in fiqh, he wastes a lot of time. And he might be wasting a ridiculous amount of time. Right? It's like crazy. Right? Or in Nahu, I'm not going to study Ajurumiyya. I'm not going to study this. I'm just going to read the books of Sibawayh. You're going to waste a ridiculous amount of time. Right? Whereas here's a matan, traditional curricula, they'll just help you save time. Right? Make things quicker for you. But they can't solve all the problems for you. Those mutun have problems. They haven't erased all the problems. There are still problems there. Still questions that are unsolved. Right? But it's just making it as useful as possible. Okay, so anyway, من حسن إسلام المرء. Right, my I mean, Okay, so he says, أخبرنا الحسين ابن عبد الله القطان بالرقع قال حدثنا هشام ابن عمار قال حدثنا محمد بن شعيب عن الأوزاعي عن قرة ابن عبد الرحمن عن الزهري عن أبي سلمة عن أبي هريرة قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن من حسن إسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعني. Right? And of the benefits, the fawaid of the Muwatta is you will know this chain very well because this chain comes up a lot in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Zuhri, the teacher of Imam Malik, from Abu Salama, son of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, from Abu Hurairah. Okay, so he says, where is this hadith? Right? So he says, Tirmidhi says, قال هذا حديث غريب لا نعرفه إلا من حديث أبي سلمة. Right? لا نعرفه إلا من not sure why this word إلا is here. لا نعرفه من حديث أبي سلمة عن أبي هريرة عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إلا من هذا الوجه. So what's happened here is this chain is so classic. Okay, this chain is so classic that Qurra ibn Abdullah or Al-Awza'i or somebody else down the line have mixed it up. Okay, and if you compare the different versions of this hadith in different places, you will find, for example, here in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, it says وَأَخْرَجَهُ مُرْسَلًا Malik في الموطأ في حسن الخلق باب ما جاء. He says عن زهري عن علي بن حسين ابن أبي طالب عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. وهكذا رواه غير واحد من أصحاب زهري. So you see all the different people narrating from Zuhri here, right? Everybody else narrates it as Zuhri quoting a different person, quoting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is not like this, right? So he says, Tirmidhi says, وهكذا روى غير واحد من أصحاب الزهري عن الزهري عن علي ibn Hussein. So this is Ali ibn Hussein ibn Abi Talib, right? The great grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مرسلا, right? Because Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, narrates from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Ali, his son, did not narrate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The great grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not narrate. There's a gap in the chain. وهذا عندنا أصح من حديث أبي سلمة. ومما قال عنه لا يصح إلا علي أحمد وابن معين والبخاري والدارقطني إلى آخره. So it is the actual chain goes through Zuhri to Zayn al-Abidin, who is Ali ibn Hussein, with a gap in the chain. We don't know who he's narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. That's the actual chain. So the real version of hadith is the weak version of the hadith. This sahih version of the hadith is actually a mistake and doesn't deserve to be in the Sahih Ibn Hibban. Does that make sense? So it's not about the chain. It's about this. It's not about the content. It's the chain. Does that make sense? So the hadith isn't sahih. It's not sahih. But that's not what we're showing. We're showing that the hadith has been narrated with the wrong chain. The actual chain that we find everybody quoting Zuhri saying is Zuhri quoting somebody else, and that person quoting the Prophet. And it is not what we see here, which is Zuhri quoting Abu Salama from Abu Hurairah. So the mistake is not here. The mistake is here. Does that make sense? And it's not Sahih now. So Ibn Hibban made a mistake by putting the hadith in his collection. He didn't make that mistake. Somebody here made the mistake. Maybe this person. Maybe Al-Awza'i. Maybe I don't know who else. Does that make sense? Why is it tricky, Muhammad? as we don't know where in the chain the error is made. Yeah, that's correct. But by comparing, this is what we do in hadith. We just compare. AI can do hadith very well. AI can't really do fiqh, but AI can do hadith well. You just say like, show AI, show me inconsistencies, and I'll give you all this data of hadiths. Find me inconsistencies in this hadith, and they'll be like, here, inconsistency, right? Because that it doesn't really resolve under. It just sees. It doesn't even know what Zuhri means. It could be anything, right? But it can just be like, yeah, there's an inconsistency here. So that's what they do. You find inconsistencies, and then over time you realize certain inconsistencies come from certain people. So those people are not good. Those people make mistakes, right? And sometimes it's not recurrent, so that there's nothing wrong with them, but clearly somebody made a mistake. Can you hear the fireworks going behind me? Can you hear that, guys? So Malaysia is you can't hear it anyway. There's fireworks happening behind me. In Malaysia, they celebrate Eid for 1 month. And then Eid al-Adha comes and they celebrate for another month. Right? So they only celebrate for 1/6 of the year. It's quite funny. Today it's Saturday here, right? So today I went to someone's house for Eid, and one of the people there was fasting. I'm like, why are you fasting? He said, oh, there's too many visits during the week. So they're visiting during the week, and on the weekend, he's trying to fast. Subhanallah. Alhamdulillah. Better than doing something else. Okay. Okay, so the second one then is شاذ المتن كالأحاديث التي صحت الأحاديث بخلافها. Right? So for example, we have these two hadiths. One hadith it says don't fast 2 days, don't fast a day or two before Ramadan. That's sahih. The other hadith says when the half of Sha'ban comes, then don't fast. So Imam Ahmad says that that's actually a conflict, right? So one hadith says don't fast a day or so before Ramadan, therefore you can fast, right? More than that, right? Don't fast a day or so, but maybe you can do, for example, the last half of Sha'ban um, or the last quarter of Sha'ban, last week of Sha'ban, right? The previous hadith says when the half of Sha'ban comes, then don't fast. So there's a conflict there, and they're not on the same level of sihha at all. So he says one hadith is actually a mistake, right? That's in terms of matan, like the content is off, right? So he says الحديث التي صحت الحديث بخلافها. There's other hadiths that go against it, and again, how we actually do this varies drastically. So for someone like Imam Malik, he'll say, look, in Medina we don't act upon this hadith, therefore it's shadh matnan, right? Whereas Imam Shafi said, well, maybe the scholars of Medina don't know everything. That's not shadh, right? So sometimes things sound odd, but they're not odd, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Well, that's because you don't know enough information, right? Like what kind of animal is a panther? Cat, okay. What color is it? It's pink. What color is a panther? Black usually, okay. So what's a black panther then? If a panther is usually black, then what's a black panther? Okay, where do black panthers live? South America, okay. So anywhere else? Okay, should we ask Sheikh Google? Sheikh Google, where do Black Panthers live? Sheikh Gemini will answer these days, okay? Go ahead, Gemini. It says black leopards. I'm talking about Black Panther. I'm not talking about black leopards or black jaguars. I'm talking about Black Panthers. You get the point I'm saying, guys? A panther is not an animal. A panther is a genus, right? Panthera is a genus. A black leopard, right, is called a black panther. And a black jaguar is called a black panther. But it's basically a leopard or a jaguar, which are two different animals. So there's two different animals, thank you, right? Black panthers, which are melanistic. So it's not an animal. So can you see that the point I'm trying to make is that in your mind, like, so what's a panther? You didn't say that's not an animal, did you? Because you say, I know what panther is. Yeah. So this is what it's like. Sometimes things sound random. Like if I said it's not an animal, there's actually an animal called a panther. That's right, you know. So this is how like we live and learn, right? Like sometimes things sound odd, like, and this is one of the problems with labeling hadiths as gharib or strange or odd, right? Is that really odd or not? Okay. So it's not super easy to do that. Does that make sense? Happy you learned something today? I think also a black cougar is also. I think they exist as well. They can double check. Cougars, as in a mountain lions. I think they can also be melanistic. In which case we also call them a panther. And I think also we refer to a cougar as a panther. I think it's one of its names. So cougar, mountain lion. I think it also called it panther as well. So that it's really not an animal, basically. Okay. So شاذ متن الأحاديث التي صحت أحاديث بخلافها أو أجمعت أئمة العلماء على قول بغيرها. And so again, when we look at the standards for the Hanafis, they're looking at the fuqaha of the Salaf, right? The top-notch fuqaha of the Salaf don't act upon that hadith, okay? Imam Ibrahim al-Nakhai was asked a question, hey, what about the hadith about raising your hands? Ibrahim al-Nakhai is like, well, you know, the students of Abdullah Misr would never do that. Right? So that's shadh for Ibrahim al-Nakhai in that that's not what the great fuqaha say. Well, what do you mean by great fuqaha? Isn't that somewhat relative, right? So what you're going to have is for the Hanafis and the Malikis, they're going to be a bit more selective of whose opinion they'll accept, particularly Imam Malik. That's not known in Medina. That's weird. That's how he functions. Okay? So the Maliki madhab is the least madhab to accept a hadith that is weird. But they may over edit, right? You know what it means to over edit? There we go. A black cougar is considered non-existence. Thank you very much. There we go. It doesn't exist. So I'm wrong. There we go. So the point is when you say shadh, right? It could be strange. There could is sometimes there's some level of judgment there, right? So he says. So وأجمعت أئمة العلماء على القول بغيرها. So for example, in Tirmidhi, he will say, every hadith I've mentioned in this book has been acted upon by some ulama apart from two. He says this hadith and this hadith. But in reality, those hadiths have been acted upon. So he's looking at them as shadh matnan, but in reality they have been acted upon, right? So that's Tirmidhi, right? So it happens. وهكذا كما وهذا كما قاله أحمد في حديث أسماء بنت عميس تسلبي ثلاثا ثم اصنعي ما بدا لك. I don't know what the hadith is about. إنه من الشاذ المطرح مع أنه قد قال به شذوذا من العلماء إن المتوفى عنها لا إحداد عليها بالكلية كما سبق ذكره في موضعه. Not quite sure what we're talking about, big. So we have to understand this book comes at the end of Tirmidhi. So the author has a commentary on Tirmidhi that has been lost. We don't have it. So he's saying on that chapter of Ihdad, what you do when a woman loses a husband, he mentions that. Wallahu a'lam. This is وكذلك حديث طاووس عن ابن عباس في الطلاق الثلاث وقد تقدم في كتاب الطلاق كلام أحمد وغيره من أما فيه وأنه شاذ مطرح. قال إبراهيم بن عبله من حمل الشاذ العلماء حمل الشر كثيرا. قال معاوية قرة إياك وشاذ العلم, right? So how do you avoid شاذ العلم today? Stick to the four madhahib. How do you get شاذ العلم today? Find a fatwa that's outside the four madhahib. Simple as that. قال شعبة لا يجيئك الحديث الشاذ إلا من الرجل الشاذ. It doesn't mean gay here. Today means when you say shad, that means gay. It doesn't mean that. قال صالح بن محمد الحافظ الشاذ الحديث المنكر الذي لا يعرف وقد تقدم قول ابن مهدي لا يكاد يكون إماما في العلم من يحدث بالشاذ من العلم. So you have to edit your content, right? It's not just everything that's sahih. Everything that has a sound chain is authentic. It's not true. Okay, inshallah, we'll continue from this next week. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Saying, so Imam Malik would be accused by other scholars of over-editing. So, for example, Imam Malik narrates the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ joined Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib and Isha. Okay, so Imam Malik says, in Medina, we do not join Dhuhr and Asr in rain. So therefore, that part of the hadith is weird. I'm going to ignore it. And that hadith is going to be applied in 50%. This last half of the hadith that says the Prophet ﷺ joined Maghrib and Isha, we're going to do that. And we're going to edit out the first part of the hadith because that's weird. And we're just going to join prayers in Maghrib and Isha. That's it for rain. Imam Shafi says, how can you do that? If the hadith is sahih, and it says the Prophet ﷺ joined Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib and Isha, how can you act upon half of the hadith? It's not fabrication. He didn't change it. He's just saying nobody. He says in Medina is not known to act upon it. So therefore, we're only going to act upon half of it. He's not changing the hadith. He narrates the hadith as it is, but only applies half of it. Imam Shafi says you have over-edited. You can't do that. If there's scholarly consensus, Medina, Mecca, Basra, everybody, right? That's different. And so Imam Shafi says, yeah, there's evidence that you can join Dhuhr and Asr for rain as well, right? Ibn Mundhir comes along and says, hang on a minute, you've over-edited too. Says, why are you limiting it to rain? So Imam Shafi only knows that in rain, so he limited it to rain. So Ibn Mundhir says, why are we limiting it to rain? It should be any need that you should allow you to join Dhuhr and Asr or Maghrib and Isha. You know what I'm saying? So somebody might come to Ibn Mundhir and say, Habibi, that's a shadh fatwa. That's a weird fatwa. That you can, you can just join any prayers for need? Is that well known? Right? Layth ibn Sa'ad, he edited even more than Imam Malik. Layth ibn Sa'ad, he said, what you guys say in Medina about joining prayers for Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib, or about Dhuhr, he said, that's not known in the Levant. He says, I studied with the people in the Levant. The people in the Levant don't know about that. So that's weird that somebody in Medina should know a hadith about joining for Maghrib and Isha when it hardly rains. But somebody in the Levant, where it rains a lot, should not know about it. And it's not known that they used to join. So this whole issue of how much do we edit, how many filters should we put on the information is very difficult. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work. It's not an easy thing. And to some extent, everybody edits the hadith to some extent, even in terms of in the light of some fiqh principle or something else. but it's a tricky process. إن شاء الله. We'll stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.